I think that we are incredibly fortunate that from living most of the time of her life up north and in retirement during the warmer months in Cape Cod. During the colder months, she and her husband Milton Teichman found themselves down here in St. Petersburg and Treasure Island, where they're living right now. They run the Teichman Art Gallery. Her husband is also an author and an artist, and they're very supportive of one another. And they are very involved in nonprofit work that helps to further their interest and their devotion to the cause of addiction. And they are, and Sharon in particular, is very keen that this not be something that within the Jewish community we remain silent about. So that's why we're here. That's what we're here to hear about, learn about, and talk about. And that's really all you want to hear from me, because we're all here to listen to Sharon. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Sharon, and I'll let you take it away from here.
Okay. I want to thank Rabbi Torup and Rabbi Weintraub and the Joint Continuing Education Program of Temple Bethel and Congregation B'nai Israel. I also want to thank the Jewish Press and the Jewish Federation of the Gulf Coast for making this talk visible and publicizing the program for me. I'm very grateful. And I want to welcome everyone from the Cape Cod Am Hayam Chavurah, the Jewish Fellowship to which I belong, and all those people from the St. Petersburg community who have joined here tonight. So thank you and welcome to everybody. The first screen are the core Jewish values that I think can guide us through our discussion of addiction, and which will come into play when we acknowledge the problem more fully in the Jewish community. I took the first quote from the Sanhedrin, but it's also a caption on a wonderful book called Jewish Sisters in Sobriety that was published in 2007 and which I can talk more about, but really helped me find my way as an adult woman in recovery, being the daughter of a father suffering from heroin addiction. And that is, whoever saves a single soul, it is as if she or he saves an entire universe. Just going one by one and paying attention to the individual stories is very important to reinforce a feeling of empowerment on those who have felt left out. And the other values, which are very important, is to know that we can repair the world with tikkun, but we can also repair ourselves. And we can heal ourselves with the support of others, refuah, and we can return to ourselves, tshuva, our whole self, our own healthy self, with the help, as one Rabbi Shea Staub has said, with the help of the God of our understanding. And we're familiar with tzedakah, caring for others. We can give support to those who suffer with addiction, but also those who are suffering from addiction can heal themselves by doing service to others. That was one of the main messages of Bill Wilson, who founded Alcoholics Anonymous. Service to others fills a gap of meaning that is really missing in the life of people suffering from addiction. And of course, the Rabbi Hillel, great sage of the first century before the Common Era. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? So I am going to refer to some of these values in my talk. I will take just about 20 minutes to present my talk. And then together, I hope we can come to some way of discussing what we can do as a Jewish community to help all of us feel included, whether we are suffering from addiction problems or not, how can we be sensitive to those who are? And I will address three main questions in my presentation. Why am I now raising the issue of the Jewish community's response to addiction? Why am I personally the one to be raising it publicly? And how has Jewish denial influenced both my life as the daughter of a father addicted to heroin and the lives of others suffering with this problem in Jewish families? Somehow I lost myself on the Zoom. So why now? Simply put, the problem is growing in magnitude, but it's being hidden from people's awareness because of the COVID epidemic. Yet, it's precisely the COVID epidemic that's making the problem worse. All addictive substances are being misused more during COVID, the most misused substance being alcohol. But for the purposes of this meeting, my attention is mainly to the misuse of opioids. As of now, COVID has taken close to 500,000 lives in the United States. Before COVID, let's compare that to the numbers of opioid-related deaths before COVID. Before COVID, from 1999 to 2015, those who died from opioid use disorder went from 8,200 annually to 33,000 annually. And in the last 2 years of that data collection, 2013 to 2015, more Americans died of opioid use disorder than died in the entire Vietnam War. But now, during COVID, the annual rate of deaths from opioid overdose has risen to 81,000. And in several individual US jurisdictions where data is available, the increase is over 50% in opioid-related deaths, including the county where I taught English and Jewish studies, Nassau County. You may know that Nassau County is one of the communities in the United States with a relatively large middle-class Jewish presence of 15 to 20%, compared to the number of Jews in the entire US population, which is 2%. Why are addictions rising now during COVID? Addiction is a way of managing pain. It could be physical pain resulting from an accident or surgery, or it could be the psychic pain when one is overcome with social and economic pressures and deprivations, isolation from social networks, loss of jobs and income, when there is uncertainty, despair, and consequently loss of hope. And psychic pain exists when we are living in a competitive market culture and never feeling quite as good as the other one. And we're feeling overcome with comparisons and feelings of being lesser. Addictive substances make one feel better temporarily. They confuse the individual into feeling for the moment that she or he is having a transcendent experience, when in reality, addictive substances lead to a total obliteration of the self, because one is living only and exclusively for the next fix. And that's what happened to the father that I witnessed. Ultimately, the problem becomes spiritual, a lack of faith in the possibility of ever living a meaningful life, a lack of hope in the possibility of a future that can be better. All these conditions have risen during COVID. But COVID is also teaching us something very important about addiction. COVID has taught us that the virus contagion can afflict anyone, no matter who you are. You can be exposed to the COVID virus, and depending on your personal health status, the infection can spread, attack vital organs, and cause death. Or you can be ill for a spell and recover. Or you can be asymptomatic, a carrier, and never feel ill at all. Likewise for addiction. The new brain science is telling us that depending on your personal health status, your own unique genetic neurological makeup, an addictive substance can cause you to become dependent, even on a first exposure, driving you to imbibe more and more of the very substance that will kill you. Or you may be able to brush with these substances, experience them, and not get addicted. Not because of your conscious choice, not because you are more morally correct or strong, not because you have a greater respect for the law and would never do anything criminal, but because of your physiological neurochemical makeup. If, like COVID, dependence on addictive substances can be experienced by anyone, then is there also addiction in the Jewish community? Or is the Jewish community immune? The long-standing myth has been, Shikar is the goy, the drunkard or addict is the Gentile, not the Jew. The Jewish community has been, for the most part, in denial in the past. Why? My own personal story illustrates the way Jewish denial affected my father's long-standing heroin addiction and motivates me now to speak out in the hopes that Jewish attitudes can change. I consider myself to be in the process of recovery. My recovery began when I started writing about my inability to keep teaching jobs because I had difficulty relating to male administrators. I started writing about my family history. That 30-year process of going public, culminating with my book, The Fix, which is based on my family story, that process was the most transformative in my entire life. My father was a kosher butcher in the East Bronx in the grip of heroin addiction from 1939, when he was 17, until 1963, when he died at age 42 of an overdose of bad stuff, probably imported from Mexico and cheaper, at a time when the heroin underground market was dominated by the Golden Triangle and the mafia, and very expensive. We in the recovery community are up against so many aspects of shame in the Jewish public sphere. There are the ancient views of those suffering from addiction as being morally weak and flawed. Like lepers, addicts in our communities have been relegated to the margins so as not to spread their moral taint. In the 1950s, at the time my father's addiction began breaking his body down, heroin users were also viewed as seedy criminals, forced into illegal shadows by the underground market to obtain their fixes. My father, to save face, capitulated with the family's desire to keep his addiction secret, hidden from his customers, hidden from our neighbors, from all my friends at school. Our hidden shame was private family business, never to be revealed. The shtetl folk saying was still operative in my mind. Shikar is the goy, the drunkard, and by extension, the addict of any sort, is a Gentile and not a Jew. Nor did I ever feel safe telling my story to anyone during my academic career as a teacher of literature, Jewish studies, and women's studies, for fear the information could be used against me, deeming me defective, the inheritor of bad seed. Teaching in fields that challenged mainstream canons of knowledge, like women's studies, I was apprehensive that the old 19th century European and Russian stereotypes of the Jew as polluter of society could affect my evaluations. I was right. My father's addiction lasted through all the treatments available in his day, treatments that were experimental then: cold turkey, psychotherapy, shock therapy, and then methadone maintenance in the beginning of the 1960s. Doctors were not immune from their biases, so my father felt treated like a sinning criminal, and as a Jew, could hardly relate to the beginnings of the 12-step programs that were being opened.
Sharon, hold on a minute. You got muted somehow. There
Okay,
you go.
okay. So my father was going to one of these new storefront methadone clinics in Harlem in the early 1960s. And the doctor there was treating his group like a Christian prayer meeting. It was a 12-step meeting, but my father, I remember telling me that he could not help, as a Jew, feeling badly, singing Amazing Grace and having to call himself a wretch. Fortunately, we are seeing signs of recognition within the Jewish community today of addiction as a problem. Fortunately, today, we see rabbis and Jewish spiritual leaders who have studied the universality of the 12 steps in depth and have shown their relation to Jewish spiritual values and to the process of tshuva, or return. Hasidic rabbis like Abraham Joshua Twersky and Rabbi Shais Taub have written extensively about addiction's source as the human need for spiritual meaning and transcendence of the self. For them, addiction is not the problem. It is the wrong-headed solution to the problem of spiritual deprivation that comes from living in a world lacking moral and ethical compass. My advanced when I first became aware of it as an 8-year-old child. I watched him suffer and decline for 9 more years before he overdosed and died. Today, the numbers of overdose deaths daily are staggering, not only in the United States, but in countries around the world. Canada and Portugal have medically controlled dispensaries for heroin addicts that have been shown to save lives. But those countries have socialized medicine. They can trust their doctors. In the US, the current epidemic is fueled medically by legal pushers, the pharmaceutical companies mainly, and hospitals and doctors who sell and distribute painkillers they know are addictive, but they sell them solely for profit, trillions of dollars. We need to be able to trust our doctors again when it comes to addiction. Again, we can learn from COVID. What would it take for the medical world to view opioid addiction as a health emergency like COVID has been treated? When I have gone into hospital, even for minor surgeries, and I say I don't want oxycodone as the anesthesia to manage my pain, I experience resistance and pressure not to be so worried. And then I say, I am worried because my father was a heroin addict and he died from an overdose. And then they understand. I want to read to you briefly an excerpt from my book, which illustrates when families are isolated and don't have the proper guidance, and there is not an understanding of addiction as a brain disease, what can happen when family members turn on one another. I started my book with the end first. The ending is when my father was taken by my grandparents to live with them when he was 42, because they felt they were the only ones who could fix my father. And they took him out of the family home. and we'll see why in a minute. Sarah is the protagonist. Her father is Joseph. Her mother is Helen. And Grandma Hannah, and Papi Mo are the grandparents. Because Joseph's problem was becoming worse while he lived at home, and the neighbors might learn about it, Sarah's grandparents had decided, against her mother's wishes, that Joseph would live with them in Queens and leave Helen and the children in Williamsburg in the apartment building her grandparents owned. Grandma Hannah and Papi Mo believed they were the only ones who could straighten out their wayward son. How they could fix him, Sarah didn't know. In the meantime, Sarah promised her mother she would never talk about her father's troubles to anyone, not even to her best friend Ruth. It was the Jewish neighbors Grandma and Papi wanted to hide Joseph from. They didn't want to expose their shanda, their shame, to the old-timers who, like them, had fled pogroms in Russia and Poland. And they didn't want the Greenhorns to know anything about Joseph's problem either. Greenhorns being the younger Orthodox families who had escaped Hitler from Hungary and Romania. When Grandma and Papi saw Joseph's problem, how deeply sick he was, they accused Sarah's mother of causing their son's problem, and they no longer invited Sarah's family to visit them in Queens. Sarah couldn't understand how the grandparents she had loved could possibly think her mother was responsible for her father's illness. Her mother took their shunning greatly to heart. She couldn't get over their rejection. She began to smoke constantly and developed a persistent cough that caused her embarrassment, especially when she tried to speak. Joseph is taken from the family, from his children and wife. He spends 8 months with his parents. He goes to that methadone clinic, which doesn't really help him. And he gets addicted back on heroin, and he overdoses and dies. But before that last resort happened, going with his parents to live, he had tried cold turkey at the Veterans Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, where he experienced doctors being somewhat heartless towards these morally flawed individuals and criminals. And many of his peers died in their beds, and he smuggled heroin into the hospital somehow. He then went into psychoanalysis with a psychiatrist in New York, and he discovered that this psychiatrist was himself addicted to heroin, and he used that information to negotiate being given morphine and continued his addiction to heroin at the same time. He often would come home high. Joseph would, as would my father. And he then had an accident, a very unfortunate accident, which the children witnessed. He happened to catch his hand in a swinging door in the kitchen, and his finger was cut in half. And the children witnessed this trauma. And while he was recovering after hospitalization, the grandparents came over. Joseph's lucky it's just a finger, Helen said, hoping to calm her mother-in-law. Hannah remained standing. Sarah, who was watching and listening from the foyer, could see that her grandmother was upset. Hannah fixed her gaze on Helen. How could you let him get away with it? How could you let Dr. Clayton pump Joseph up with drugs? Dr. Clayton was supposed to be taking care of Joseph. How dare you blame me again? When are you going to face facts? Your son is the one with the problem, and he's a grown man. Ask him what happened. Give him some respect. No, Papi Mo chimed in. What happened, son? He's sick, that's what happened, Hannah continued. He needs to be watched. She pointed her finger accusingly at Helen. She wasn't watching. She doesn't know how to care for our son. Watch your words, Ma, Joseph blasted back. Helen's my wife, not my babysitter. Now listen to me. We found a place that could help me. Maybe in no time my problem could be over. You found a place? You mean Helen found a place. Don't fool yourself, Joseph. What kind of place? The last place Helen found in Kentucky, you were able to bribe some imbecile to get you drugs. We can't trust Helen. She didn't even notice you were still on heroin. How unfair you are, Helen yelled. I give my Joseph all my sympathetic understanding. You don't give him that. So Dr. Clayton turned out to be a fraud, but the right psychiatrist can help Joseph. And we think there's a better one at the place we found. They found Hawthorne Lodge, Grandma, Sarah burst out, emerging from the foyer. But they give people shocks there. What are you saying, Sarah? Her father asked, worried. No more eavesdropping, young lady, Helen said. You don't want more bad dreams, do you? Why don't you do your homework now? It's quiet in the bedroom. We'll let you know when we come up with a plan. Let the child talk, Hannah said. What are you saying, dear, about shocks? She doesn't understand, Ma, Helen answered. Joseph bent down and put his good arm around Sarah. Aren't you afraid, Daddy, of being shocked? He continued. Honey, shock treatment is our last resort. It's a new way to treat addiction. We need to look into it more carefully, and I don't know if I'll qualify. They have to interview me, and I need to interview them. It's no small decision. The good part is I'll have a private doctor. It's not at all like Lexington. A pained expression spread across his face. The doctors were like jailers there. We need to visit Hawthorne Lodge to see what it's like. Well, you learn more about Sarah's family in the book, but my question is, what can we do now to prevent families like mine from turning against one another in blame when addiction is in the family? If we could accept the scientific community's identification of addiction as a brain disease, affecting the brain's hierarchy of needs and desires and its impulse control mechanisms, maybe the moral and criminal shame associated with this illness could be shed. Maybe then Jews afflicted with this tragic disability could feel safer reaching out for help the way my father could not. I'd like to turn to you who have been listening to me. And I wonder if at this point, before we look at some ways that I think the Jewish community could respond to addiction in an enlightened way, I'd like to know if anyone has any comments or questions or wants to respond in some way to that presentation. Because for now, we can discuss together.
So what I'm going to ask you all to do, thank you so much, Sharon, for sharing your wisdom and your writing as well. Very moving. Sherry is giving us a great example, because if you see on the little reactions button somewhere on your screen, you can put up that little hand. It says raise hand, and then we know that you would like to share something with us. So Sherry, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, and if you want to share a comment. You have to push the unmute first.
Now, can you hear me? I'll start by telling you our experience. And this goes back to 1979. We had a teenager who we were told was into drugs. And we needed to come over to our friend's home, whose daughter was telling them what the two girls had been doing. We went over there immediately. got the story about what was going on. And the very next day, we took our daughter to a teenage drug rehab, which was the first one here in St. Petersburg. Of all the children, and I call them children because they were teenagers up to the age of 18, ours were the only two Jewish kids in the group. And as it turned out, ours were the only two Jewish kids who were involved in drugs in our Jewish community back in those days. So, and I'm being sarcastic. So it was very interesting. It didn't bother me a bit. I was thrilled to know that this was what was going on with my daughter. And I was happy to have her in the program. And she was there for a year and a half, as her friend was as well. And they are both wonderful adults, contributing to society. And the whole thing that that I can think about is that all these people whose kids were doing the same thing that our kids were doing were quiet about the situation. And whether they survived or they didn't, I don't know. And some didn't. Some went on to it's like alcoholism. It's a spectrum. Some people can handle it, some people cannot. And this was our experience. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you, Sherry. Catherine?
Hi, my name is Catherine, and I'm a sober alcoholic. I'm sober 43 years, and I have shared this information with my rabbi. I live in Concord, Massachusetts, and my synagogue is at Temple Beth Israel in Waltham, Massachusetts. And I told him so that I could be a source of help to anyone that he felt had a need. I'm very active in Alcoholics Anonymous as well as in Al-Anon. My oldest son is sober 36 years. He's 55 years old. I'm 76. And I want to say, Sharon, you're a very brave woman. I just am very impressed that you would speak so clearly and strongly on this matter. And I was active with JACS, Jewish Alcoholics and Chemically Dependent Others, when I first got sober. I was at a retreat held in Catskills, 42, at least 42 or 43 years old. It may have been the first or second. I was in new sobriety, and it was very instrumental in my spiritual healing because Jews came from all walks of life there, from the Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, and atheist. And at the time I was angry against God because I was wounded. I was wounded and I was sick and I didn't understand my predicament exactly. And I was overwhelmed being a single parent and having very few resources. This is back in '77. And I'm just saying that to have been presented with this, and if any of you have any way of actively supporting this organization, because it's floundering. I spoke with the woman in New York City, anticipating being on the Zoom tonight so that I could offer this resource. And I have the book here that Rabbi Twersky, the 12 steps, and I just want to urge you to call Jackson to maybe reactivate this organization so that there is more hope and more information and less shame, less denial. So that's why my Hebrew teacher saw the advertisement. Her temple is in Sudbury, and it's also named Temple Bethel. So she told me about this and gave me the information, and I was able to contact and get the link, the Zoom numbers tonight. So thank you so much for speaking out and for passing the word. And I'm here in Concord, Massachusetts, also willing to speak out. Thank you.
Thank you. Sharon, before I ask Anna, do you want to respond at all?
Yeah, first I'd like to respond to Shari and to say, I see she's left the screen. So let me respond to Catherine and say that this has been a book that has helped me tremendously, published by JAX, the organization that you participated in, Jewish Sisters in Sobriety.
How would I get a copy?
Look online, Google it, and
Okay.
you can get it.
Thank you.
Online.
Thank
And
you.
I'm gonna donate this to our Jewish community. I think it's a book that we need to have in our community, in our libraries. But it illustrates what Catherine is saying about women from all walks of life finding community in a 12-step environment, which translated the 12 steps into Jewish values. Some of the language of the original AA seems like it's a different type of religious way of thinking about God. For example, steps 1, 2, and 3 of the original 12 steps. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. 2, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Okay, some of that language did not reflect our own sense of empowerment as Jews to have a partnership with God. It may have seemed too hierarchical of a relationship. So we can translate this into Jewish values. This would be just one suggestion. We could believe in the necessary relationship, the partnership between the individual and a creative power of transformation in the universe that helps the individual find meaning and hope in life. That power can be the God of our understanding, or it could be the connection between the individual and support of others in the community. Some people in 12-step meetings say, you are the God of my understanding, you who have supported me. And my sources are Rabbi Twersky, as was cited by Catherine, and Rabbi Taub, also Abraham Joshua Heschel, Rabbi Michael Lerner, and also the philosopher Martin Buber. But it might even be a good exercise to turn the first 3 steps into your definition of reaching out for help. Essentially, you're accepting the fact that you need help. My father said to us, when I'm good and ready, I'm gonna stop. He thought he was in control. He never was able to reach out. He was filled with too much shame. And I applaud Shari and Catherine for reaching out. That is a far way to go, to just reach out for help and not keep it locked up inside. Okay, that's it for me right now.
Deanna, do you
Yeah. Sharon, do you have some ideas about what Jewish organizations or the various different kinds of Jewish communities that exist should be doing?
Well,
Your talk is one thing, but it seems to be that it needs much more widespread action.
Yeah. Well, I do have some ideas, and here are some of my ideas. And they're not only my ideas, but they've come from others. You know, one reason Jews don't often come to 12 steps is that they're usually held in churches, and the atmosphere is not always so comfortable. It would be good if synagogues and temples were known as welcoming places for support groups. It wouldn't have to be 12 steps, but any kind of support group where people could share their stories with one another so they know they're not alone. This would be a very big step to take, to meet in a synagogue or a temple. Also, when we have holidays and events, and I mentioned Purim is coming up, clearly this is a very uncomfortable thing for an alcoholic. We can offer sober alternatives to alcohol consumption at our events, and that should be normalized so that people can have options of their choice. Also, I would say, and this might be, more religious, but we can have refreshing interpretations of Torah portions. For example, Noah is often cited as a very bad example to point up as, someone who was sinning, and then his sons had different responses. I would say let's look at Noah for a different reason. Let's say that the culprit in the story is the shaming of the father. One of the sons just exposes what the father is doing, creates shame, and for that, the son is punished. And, maybe too harshly, but at least it's recognized that shaming is the culprit. What about the other sons in the Noah story? They help the father take care of himself. They cover him, they hate him, they help him, they show supportive caring. Why should we place stumbling blocks before the blind? If someone is suffering from addiction, we don't want to make it worse with stigma and shame. But we can look at the other Torah portions where drinking is mentioned, and let's give more enlightened interpretations to these Torah portions. What about when we give announcements and we write articles in the newsletter that reflect achievements? Why not select achievements of those in recovery? Catherine identified herself as being many years in recovery. And I'm happy to say, although I started late, I didn't acknowledge that I was a person in recovery until I was 69. I wished I had been able to do that. Let's talk about those recovery hallmarks. And why don't we also have alerts about bad substances being circulated in the community? So many of the overdose deaths today are caused not per se by heroin, but what the heroin is laced with to save money and to make a greater profit, deadly substances that cause death on the first intake for some young people. They can stop breathing automatically when they take fentanyl or carfentanil. It's an elephant tranquilizer, an elephant. And this is put into opioids and into heroin. And we need to try to revive these kids. But if we knew more about them, and I think the Jewish communities can circulate that information, be on alert, aware. Well, what else? So these are some ideas.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
So I've got a little bit of a lineup of hands. So Kate is going to share a little bit, including sharing one of our mutual friends who has written some spiritual works on the subject. Then I see Dorsey wanted to say something, and then Sherry wanted to say something. So Kate?
Okay. So first of all, I really want to say thank you. This is a needed program, Sharon. And I appreciate your coming out and being willing to talk about it. I also really want to say that in the communities that I'm around, it's very much a subject that is out in the open. And the mutual friend that Rabbi Phil is talking about is a gentleman by the name of Ilan Glazer, who happens to be a rabbi. And I posted in the chat the name of his book. And he, I was going to say attacks the subject, but he discusses it in a very spiritual way. And it really applies to almost any kind of an addiction that a person might have. So I highly recommend it if you're interested in that subject. And I'll pass it on to the next person. And again, say thank you, Sharon.
So, and one possibility, maybe continuing book clubs on some of these subjects and giving people the opportunity to share those stories. So maybe, we've been blessed to hear from you. Maybe one of our communities will, maybe the Hadassah Book Club wants to use your book in the future, or maybe they want to use the Rabbi Glazer's book, but to create more opportunities for us just to have these conversations. So Dorsey, you wanted to share something?
I just read The Fix for the second time, and I want to recommend that all of you should purchase it and read it. It's a very important book. And one thing I especially learned from Sharon in the second reading was that the extended family made a huge difference. Now, you could say there were positive and negative things about the extended family. So Sharon's story is going to be different than a lot of stories in the 21st century because we don't have these extended families living near each other anymore. But I think that maybe what saved her and what saved their family was the extended family.
Sharon, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point you're raising. In the community that I come from, Cape Cod, an interesting reversal has become the pattern. The young adults have a very high incidence of heroin addiction and opioid addiction on Cape Cod. And very frequently, they are in treatment, and the children, and I identify with those, are placed with grandparents who are sober and never had addiction problems. So grandparents are now, in large measure, raising the children of addicted parents. And often it's both parents who are addicted. So that's an interesting point. The extended family comes into play in that they play a role in supporting the kids. One other thing I'd like to say is that I do have copies of my book. If anybody is interested in reading it, just contact me. And I don't know if you know how to do that, but I could put it in the chat what my telephone number is.
I think that was a very important reminder there that families in some ways are the first line of defense, and how they react makes a big difference. Are we supporting one another? If we have a child, a loved one, a parent, what's our first reaction when we find out that secret? Do we, yell and scream and say, "How could you?" Or we recognize that they're going through a major challenge in their life? And Sherry, I see you. I want to give Audrey Greenberg, and then Sherry, we'll get you back.
Okay, so Sharon, you are an extraordinary person. It had to be extremely traumatic for you to see your father go through this. in every aspect of it, and then to lose him when you were so young. I wonder about your book because I knew of your book, but I haven't seen it. And I guess I was a little surprised when you were reading from it that I thought it was an autobiography. And so I'm guessing that it's somehow fictionalized. And I'm curious about that. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, when I was going through my difficulty with the loss of many jobs, and I saw a pattern in my own behavior, I started writing, as I mentioned, about my family history, and I wanted to write a memoir about my relationship to my father. And I found that I was trying to uncover and analyze and include everything that I could possibly find about the situation and why him. You know, I didn't have this brain science. So I was psychoanalyzing him and his heritage. And I was getting overwhelmed and I was feeling victimized once again by all the details of what I was going through. But I was a teacher of literature, and it came to me that I could write something like what I was teaching, that if I was writing a novel, that it would ease the burden somehow of the reality that was still pressing in on me. And I knew that a novel needed to have good and bad people. A good novel doesn't only have cartoon characters. And I have to tell you that before I started writing about my father, what I had for him was hate and rage. You know, after he died, I just came out with all the anger and hate and why me. And I spent quite a few years in therapy to understand, why am I lesser than everybody else? Why did the, did the cards turn against me? And I realized that that wasn't the full story. And fiction helped me to the truth. The truth was my father had good and bad. I could have never created the father character who tried to explain things to Sarah in that little excerpt until I started writing a novel about him. And so the distance of creating it as a persona helped me reach the truth.
Thank you. Shari? We can hear you.
I think that the most important thing that you can give a person who is in pain, and that's the person who has the addiction, or our experience, my husband's and mine, is with teenagers and then later on an adult. But I believe that showing love and having them know that they have a place to come to, place to go, a place to feel comfortable, is the most important thing that we can do for someone who is in pain. And they are in pain, and that's why they are doing what they are doing. So I guess the bottom line is just to continue to love and accept and welcome. Yes, and my husband would like to say something.
Our experience with our daughter was that she was involved in a program with a number of addicts like herself. And the successful program at that time, which was really the only one, and there were many other organizations that followed many of their procedures, was that each of the children would express their experiences with one another. And we as parents, which is a very important part of the treatment, would, I'll hold it down, would participate in the program. And in addition to that, we would bring certain children into our household, so that you had the program itself, which was a therapy program, and the fact that 4, 5, or 6 children would come into our home and experience, a loving family. So when you put that together, I felt, and I think we experienced it, that the children appreciated the love that they were getting from each other, plus the attention and the love that they were getting from another family. And eventually, when they graduated from that program, they went back to their family, who was a part of the program that we were. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Sharon?
Yeah, I think that's so important what you're saying. Is it Mr. Green?
Herb.
Oh, Herb.
Herb is fine.
I think it's so important what you're saying, to have a loving concern for all those in your daughter's community and being models for other families. It reminds me, your story about coming together and talking about it, about the connection that I see in giving your own testimony or story, and how that helps you see there are others like you and that it's not your fault. When you share the ideas about how you got involved or what happened to you, you see patterns, and you see that there are conditions that created what was creating the pain and the negative feelings and the feelings of being left out. And then you could see, as I said, it's so important to see that it's not your fault, and that what you're doing is a way of trying to help yourself feel better. But the way of making yourself feel better on a substance, like an addictive substance, is self-destructive. And so you want to feel better in a good way, and having a community can fill that gap. And it is that gap because you feel alone and so isolated. I have to say that I learned that type of thing from being involved in the women's movement. I don't know how many women are going to relate to this, but I grew up during the period of consciousness raising. And when women got together and talked about the conditions in their lives, they realized that they were feeling like second-class citizens, not because it was their fault, but because there was something wrong in the society that was treating them that way. And I think there's something, I believe that the conditions in our culture reinforce the feelings of lack of connection and isolation, competitiveness. And, there's a Jewish run treatment center in Los Angeles called Beit Tshuva. And the articles written about it, actually, it was Rabbi Deanna Douglas who brought this to my attention. The people there would speak about why did they get addicted, and they said it was the competition. I had to prepare my kids for all the grades and the evaluations and doing better than the next one, that was a very big factor in causing the need for escape from all of that. And recently I heard rabbis talk about this topic. Again, Rabbi Douglas connected me with a group of rabbis that were talking about this topic. And Beit Tshuva has an extension now in New York called the Tshuva Center. And at the Tshuva Center, they have found that the two big reasons for getting involved with drugs and addiction are traumas in the family, and adoption. There are a lot of people who are adopted who don't feel integrated. But in general, it's pain, pain of not fitting in and feeling isolated from supportive community.
Well, I want to turn over to my co-host and give Rabbi Torup one more comment before we close off for the evening. But I just want to thank everybody so much for all of their participation, for recognizing that this is not, as Sharon said, that a shikar isn't a goy, that this is a problem in our community. It has always been a problem. It is not a new problem. It's just been a quiet problem. And by spotlighting it and sharing those stories, we can make an effort to do better for our children, for our spouses, for our parents, for all those that have this great challenge. Rabbi?
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. I wanted to, I had one comment I wanted to make, but I also just wanted to say one thing that was prompted by what you just said, Sharon, which is, I think that in addition to those life situations which you named that contribute to the pain and the trauma and the the existential realities that can contribute to life's tremendous pain that can be what people sometimes look to escape from through drugs and alcohol, that we not lose sight of the fact that addiction and alcoholism is a disease. And I think that's one of the words we haven't mentioned very much tonight. And yeah, I think that that's one of the things that we need to really keep lifting up, because it's one of the reasons why there ought to not be shame about it. We are, and you made so many amazing parallels in your comments to COVID and to other disease-like experiences or disease experiences, right? And we should know that alcoholism and addiction, they're diseases. And some of us have those diseases. Right? And we're so willing as Jews to talk about every other ailment we have. Right? And there are a few that are just, it's a shanda to talk about it. But if you have it, or somebody in your family has it, right? And so that's just one piece I want to just lift up. And the last thing I wanted to say was, I was really struck in your response to Audrey and what Audrey was saying, that what you have lifted up is the narrative quality of experience and of life. That we live our life as narratives and as stories, and we learn narratives, and we hold on to narratives, whether they reflect reality or not, because we make them our reality. And then some of the most important work we do in our lives is to figure out how we need to change our narrative. And so one of the things I think, Sharon, that you have invited us into tonight is the process whereby you created a new narrative. And in so doing, you saw your life and the truths in your life in a different way. And that was a very powerful insight, I think, that you shared with us, because sometimes we're so afraid of questioning the narrative that we have held on to about the life we've led. And you offered us a new perspective on how do we understand the narratives of our lives. And so I thank you for that. And I think we all owe you a debt of gratitude for having helped us to see that there are many different ways to look at and to wrestle with the narratives of who we are and who we have come from and where we're going. So I thank you for that.
So I think we're all sending a round of applause to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, let's not make this the ending of the conversation. So let's take some of these ideas and plan to work with them. And thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this. And thank
So-
you all for participating.
So I wish you all a good night. I think this was a really moving and meaningful program. I also was just honored for us to be doing this holy work together, that this is not something that's limited to one congregation or one community, but we are all here in St. Petersburg and around the world dealing with these same challenges. And the more we can work together and share beautiful and powerful and challenging stories, the better off we all will be. So thank you again.
Thank you.
All right.
Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.